Trump's most dangerous political move. January 20th, 2025. The day that changed everything. While cameras focused on the pomp and ceremony of Inauguration Day, something far more sinister was unfolding beneath the surface. President Donald Trump, freshly sworn into his second term, was about to execute a political maneuver so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would fundamentally reshape the balance of power in American democracy. But what nobody expected was how far he would actually go. Within hours, Trump signed executive orders declaring multiple national emergencies simultaneously, at the southern border, in the energy sector, and across the economic landscape. This wasn't about addressing crises. This was about seizing power. And the truly terrifying part? It was completely legal. The scope was breathtaking. With a single stroke, Trump activated dormant statutory authorities that presidents had accumulated over decades but rarely dared to use. 150 emergency powers, lying dormant in federal law, waiting to be awakened. Powers to seize communications networks. Powers to freeze bank accounts. Powers to deploy military forces domestically. All of this became available the moment Trump declared these emergencies. Constitutional scholars who had warned about this for years watched in horror as their worst fears materialized. I've never seen a president invoke emergency powers to justify practically all of his policy agenda, one expert told reporters, his voice trembling with disbelief. And I've also never seen a president use them to seize powers that really are not in the statutes at all. But that was just the beginning. Naquele momento, tudo mudou. While the nation was still processing the emergency declarations, Trump's team activated Project 2025, the 900-page blueprint that he had publicly disavowed during his campaign. The plan had been dismissed as a conservative fantasy, a wish list that even Trump claimed not to know about. But here's what nobody wanted to admit. At least 270 of Project 2025's proposals matched Trump's own past policies, previous actions, or current campaign promises. It wasn't a fringe manifesto. It was the playbook. And now, with emergency powers in hand and absolute immunity granted by his Supreme Court, Trump had everything he needed to implement it. The first target was the civil service, the 50,000 federal employees who formed the backbone of American government. These weren't political appointees. They were career professionals. Scientists at the EPA, analysts at the State Department, specialists at the Department of Energy. People who had served under presidents from both parties, who took an oath to the Constitution, not to any individual leader. But they stood in the way. Trump reissued Schedule F, the executive order he had signed in the final months of his first term before President Biden reversed it. Schedule F stripped civil service protections from tens of thousands of federal jobs, creating a new employment category where workers could be fired at will. The purge began immediately. This would be the most profound change to the civil service system since its creation in 1883, warned one Georgetown political scientist. It would be a catastrophe for government performance and for democracy. Within weeks, thousands of federal employees received termination notices. Their crime? Not party affiliation, not incompetence. Their crime was independence. They were replaced by loyalists handpicked from a database Project 2025 had been building for years, a roster of MAGA faithful who had passed ideological purity tests, who had trained at a private administration academy designed specifically to prepare them for this moment. These weren't experts in their fields. They were soldiers in a political army. Johnny McEntee, one of Trump's closest White House aides during his first term and described as his most fervent internal loyalty enforcer, was a senior advisor to Project 2025. Stephen Miller, architect of the first administration's most controversial policies, had helped blueprint the entire operation. This wasn't improvisation. This was a carefully orchestrated takeover. The Department of Justice was next. Project 2025 had been explicit. Weaponize the DOJ and FBI. Make them tools of presidential power rather than independent guardians of law. Within his first 100 days back in office, Trump ordered criminal investigations into more than 100 perceived enemies, political opponents, news organizations, former government officials, universities, law firms. Consider just 1 week in April. On Wednesday, April 9th, Trump ordered criminal probes into 2 former Trump administration officials, saying one was guilty of treason, a crime punishable by death. That same day, he signed an order targeting a law firm for alleged election misconduct. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Loyalty would be rewarded. Independence would be destroyed. But the most dangerous move wasn't happening in Washington. It was happening at the border. Trump's January 20th proclamation declared that irregular crossings meant nothing less than America's sovereignty is under attack. But here's the crucial detail: there was no actual invasion. Border crossings had been declining. The crisis was manufactured. Yet by declaring a national emergency, Trump unlocked powers that previous presidents had reserved for actual wars. He invoked 10 U.S.C. Section 12302 to mobilize reserve forces. He used 10 U.S.C. Section 2808 to divert military construction funds, billions of dollars that Congress had appropriated for other purposes. He authorized the military to seize federal lands along a 60-foot strip stretching from New Mexico to California, creating a national defense area where soldiers could detain migrants without normal legal processes. In April, Trump declared a trade emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, a statute originally designed for genuine national crises like the Iran hostage situation in 1979. Trump claimed that America's trade deficit constituted an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security. With that declaration, he imposed sweeping reciprocal tariffs against nearly all U.S. trading partners. Constitutional scholars were stunned. Presidents had used IEPA 77 times since 1977, but almost always for geographically specific emergencies targeting rogue nations or terrorist organizations. Trump had transformed it into a tool for implementing his entire economic agenda. The way decisions are getting made are very fast-paced and not done in a more methodical, comprehensive, strategic approach, explained one policy analyst. It's just a very different way to approach policy. The pattern was becoming clear. Every policy priority, every campaign promise, every item on the conservative wish list was being repackaged as an emergency. Energy policy. National energy emergency declared on day 1, excluding solar, wind, and batteries while fast-tracking coal and natural gas projects. Trump ordered 4 retiring coal plants to keep operating in the name of grid reliability while simultaneously halting construction of 5 offshore wind projects for national security reasons. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Critics pointed out that it made no sense to block power plants from being built while claiming national security required keeping old, polluting facilities open. But logic didn't matter. Emergency powers didn't require logical consistency. They only required a presidential signature. Immigration enforcement escalated into something unprecedented. Trump used IEPA to designate gang organizations like Tren de Aragua and MS-13 as foreign terrorist organizations. This wasn't just symbolic. It unlocked authorities to freeze assets, block transactions, and pursue members with tools normally reserved for international terrorism. He pledged mass deportations of 11 million undocumented immigrants. Project 2025 had outlined the methods, requiring cooperation from local law enforcement, authorizing tent camps to detain migrants, eliminating due process protections. Within months, ICE raids became routine. Families were separated. Communities lived in terror. And all of it was justified under emergency authorities. The speed of the transformation was dizzying. Trump signed 225 executive orders in his first year alone, more than any president in modern history had issued in a full 4-year term. Each one pushed boundaries. Each one tested limits. Each one normalized what had previously been unthinkable. To Trump, everything is an emergency, concluded one legal scholar who had studied presidential power for decades. The National Emergencies Act, designed in 1976 to create oversight and accountability, had become a rubber stamp. Congress could vote to terminate an emergency, but it effectively needed a veto-proof majority to do so. With Republicans controlling both chambers, there was no check, no balance, no restraint. What made Trump's approach truly dangerous wasn't just the scope. It was the precedent. Previous presidents had pushed boundaries, had tested the limits of executive authority. But they had operated within guardrails, respecting norms even when they disagreed with them. Trump obliterated those norms. He declared emergencies where no rational person would believe they existed. He invoked powers that weren't actually in the statutes. He wielded emergency authorities to implement his entire policy agenda rather than responding to genuine crises. And he did it all while his Supreme Court, dominated by 6 conservative justices who subscribed to varying degrees to the unitary executive theory, provided legal cover. That theory argued the Constitution's framers had envisioned a strong consolidation of presidential power. With that court and absolute immunity from prosecution, Trump had become virtually unconstrained. The international implications were equally alarming. Trump had promised to end major wars and deliver peace. Instead, according to the Peace Research Institute Oslo, there were more state-based armed conflicts in 2024 than at any point in the past 70 years. The historic high carried into 2025. By year's end, peace deals were still out of reach in Ukraine and Sudan, and a 3-phase ceasefire plan in Gaza had effectively stalled. Trump's first foreign policy moves of 2026 included threatening military action in Venezuela, attempting to coerce Greenland into becoming U.S. territory, and withdrawing from 66 international organizations. The United States formally exited the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accords. It shut down USAID and slashed funding for UN agencies. American leadership on democracy and human rights evaporated. The domestic crackdown intensified. Universities became targets. The Trump administration launched investigations into dozens of schools, citing failures to protect students from anti-Semitism and alleged civil rights violations related to diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. The administration pulled billions in funding. Trump threatened to revoke Harvard's tax-exempt status, complaining on Truth Social that the university had hired, almost all woke, radical left, idiots, and bird brains. Vice President J.D. Vance had given a speech titled, "The Universities Are the Enemy." Now that worldview was becoming government policy. Faculty members were investigated. Programs were defunded. Academic freedom withered under federal pressure. But what nobody expected was how this would reshape everyday American life. Civil rights laws were weaponized against what Trump called anti-white discrimination. The Department of Justice began investigating and prosecuting institutions, including private employers, with diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. Trump had bragged during his campaign that his administration would ban critical race theory, a misnomer he and his allies had attached to virtually any racial justice initiative. Now he promised to finish the job. Gender equality became another target. Project 2025 called for removing gender equality or gender equity from every piece of federal legislation. Every policy, regulation, and executive order aimed at promoting gender equality was reversed. The Gender Policy Council was dissolved. Programs described as subsidizing single motherhood were eliminated, along with services for working families like overtime pay protections and Head Start early childhood education. Social insurance programs that Americans had relied on for generations came under assault. Project 2025 had stated that Social Security could not be covered here in depth, but the architects made clear their intentions to cut benefits. For Medicare and Medicaid, the blueprint called for time limits or lifetime caps on benefits to disincentivize permanent dependence on publicly funded health benefits. Democratic lawmakers described this as dangerous and unnecessary, but with Republicans controlling Congress and Trump wielding emergency authorities, objections were steamrolled. Food assistance programs like SNAP were gutted. Efforts to offer free universal school meals were rejected. The safety net that had protected vulnerable Americans for nearly a century was being systematically dismantled. The military was being transformed into a domestic enforcement tool. Trump issued an executive order titled Restoring the United States Department of War in September 2025, a symbolic move that reflected his administration's militaristic approach to governing. Project 2025 had called for politicizing the military chain of command and U.S. intelligence agencies. It recommended dismantling the Department of Homeland Security and redistributing its functions. It targeted the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency for its efforts to combat online misinformation, calling them politically motivated despite warnings from national security experts that Russia, China, and Iran were weaponizing social media networks. The document appears blind to the fact that these adversaries are creating false narratives that weaken U.S. national security, one expert warned. But those warnings were ignored. The federal bureaucracy that had operated with relative consistency across Democratic and Republican administrations for over a century was being replaced with a loyalty-based system. Career experts who understood complex regulatory frameworks, who maintained institutional knowledge, who provided continuity between administrations, all were being purged. In their place came ideologues whose primary qualification was fealty to Trump. The EPA was being staffed by climate change deniers. The Department of Education by people who wanted to eliminate it entirely. The State Department by isolationists who rejected America's traditional global leadership role. The FDA and CDC by appointees skeptical of public health measures. Every agency, every department, every function of government was being remade to serve one man's vision. The Supreme Court's role in enabling this transformation cannot be overstated. In June 2024, before Trump's second inauguration, the court had granted presidents broad immunity from criminal prosecution for official acts. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the 6-3 conservative majority, declared that presidents needed presumptive immunity to function effectively. Critics warned this would make presidents effectively above the law. Within a year, those warnings proved prophetic. Trump openly discussed targeting political enemies for treason, a capital crime. He revoked security clearances of critics without due process. He used federal agencies to punish news organizations that reported unfavorably on him. And he did it all knowing that the Supreme Court had granted him immunity from prosecution. Lower federal courts provided a mixed picture. As one scholar noted, some judges pushed back, issuing temporary restraining orders against the most extreme actions. But the overall trend favored executive power. Judges appointed by Trump himself were more likely to defer to presidential authority. And when cases reached the Supreme Court, the conservative supermajority consistently ruled in favor of expansive executive power. The checks and balances that the Constitution's framers had carefully constructed were failing. Congress wouldn't act. The courts wouldn't stop him. The press was under assault. Civil society organizations faced investigations and funding cuts. The system was breaking down in real time. Public opinion showed warning signs. A Quinnipiac poll in mid-December 2025 found that 54% of voters thought Trump was going too far in his authority claims, while only 37% thought he was handling the role correctly. Another 7% believed Trump should go further. A Politico poll found 53% of Americans thought Trump had too much power. His approval ratings slumped throughout 2025. But here's the terrifying question. Would it matter? Does the average person really think much about any of the theoretical bases for the things Trump is doing? Mused one political scientist. And frankly, would the average person care very much if the results were, in the short term, results of which they approved? That was the genius of Trump's strategy. Package everything as emergency response. Promise to fix problems. Deliver some tangible results, even if manufactured or superficial. Keep people focused on culture war issues while fundamentally transforming the structure of government. International interventionism took a bizarre turn. Despite condemning his predecessors as interventionists, in a May speech in Riyadh, Trump repeatedly inserted himself into the domestic affairs of other countries. He openly backed right-wing, illiberal, or authoritarian politicians in multiple nations. He praised aligned politicians while attacking their opponents. In some cases, he deployed punitive tariffs or sanctions against political or legal authorities who angered him. Argentina's president, El Salvador's Nayib Bukele, Hungary's Viktor Orban, all received Trump's enthusiastic support, even as they dismantled democratic institutions in their own countries. When Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu was arrested in Turkey in March 2025, Trump said nothing. When Bukele removed presidential term limits in El Salvador, the Trump administration celebrated. The selective nature of Trump's interventionism revealed its true purpose, supporting autocrats who shared his worldview while undermining democracies that didn't. The transformation of America's role in the world was complete. For 70 years, the United States had positioned itself as the leader of the free world, the champion of democracy, the defender of human rights. That era was over. Trump dismantled pro-democracy assistance programs. He dissolved most of the State Department's institutional capacity on democracy issues. He disabled most of U.S. global broadcasting, traditionally a linchpin of democracy support. American influence was now being wielded to support authoritarians and undermine democratic norms. Allies were confused. Adversaries were emboldened. The international order that America had built and maintained since 1945 was crumbling. Other populist leaders around the world watched Trump's success and took notes. If emergency powers could be weaponized to bypass democratic constraints in America, why not elsewhere? The precedent was set. The playbook was written. And as 2026 began, analysts warned that the erosion of democratic norms wasn't just an American problem anymore. It was a global trend, and Trump had accelerated it dramatically. So what made this Trump's most dangerous political move? It wasn't any single action. It was the systematic dismantling of constitutional constraints on presidential power. It was the normalization of emergency authorities as tools of routine governance. It was the purging of independent expertise from government. It was the weaponization of federal agencies against political enemies. It was the Supreme Court's complicity in granting immunity from accountability. It was the transformation of America's global role from democracy champion to autocracy enabler. It was all of these things happening simultaneously, reinforcing each other, creating a new reality where one person's will could override institutions, norms, laws, and the Constitution itself. The framers of the Constitution had feared this moment. They had designed a system of checks and balances specifically to prevent any single person from accumulating too much power. They had created separate branches with distinct authorities. They had built in mechanisms for accountability and oversight. They had assumed that ambition would counteract ambition, that each branch would jealously guard its prerogatives, that the system itself would resist tyranny. But they hadn't anticipated a scenario where one party would control all branches and choose loyalty to a person over loyalty to the institution. They hadn't imagined a Supreme Court that would grant presidents virtual immunity. They hadn't foreseen a Congress that would abdicate its responsibility to check executive overreach. They hadn't predicted that emergency powers, accumulated over decades for use in genuine crises, would be weaponized for routine policy implementation. The consequences were already visible by early 2026. Federal agencies had become instruments of partisan control rather than public service. Career employees lived in fear of expressing professional judgment that contradicted political directives. Scientists self-censored. Diplomats resigned. Lawyers who had spent careers defending the rule of law found themselves defending the indefensible or leaving government entirely. The talent drain was catastrophic. The institutional knowledge being lost was irreplaceable. And the precedents being set would haunt America for generations. Future presidents, regardless of party, would inherit the expanded powers Trump had claimed. Some might exercise restraint, others might not. But the genie was out of the bottle. International relations had entered a dangerous new phase. With America abandoning its role as democracy promoter, authoritarian regimes grew bolder. China accelerated its crackdown on Hong Kong and increased pressure on Taiwan. Russia pushed further into Ukraine. Iran escalated its nuclear program. North Korea conducted more missile tests. These regimes had watched Trump's domestic transformation and concluded that America would no longer challenge their behavior. They were right. Trump's administration was too busy consolidating power at home to effectively project power abroad. The result was a more dangerous world where authoritarianism was on the march and democracy was in retreat. Trust in institutions collapsed to historic lows. 54% of Americans believed Trump was going too far, but they felt powerless to stop him. The tools of democratic accountability, elections, courts, public pressure seemed inadequate against a president wielding emergency authorities and protected by immunity. Young Americans who had grown up believing in democratic norms watched those norms shattered. Their cynicism would shape politics for decades. The social fabric was tearing. Families divided over politics stopped speaking. Communities fractured along partisan lines. Violence increased as rhetoric escalated. The center couldn't hold because there was no center anymore. The most chilling aspect was how quickly it had all happened. 13 months. That's how long it took for Trump to implement much of Project 2025, purge thousands of civil servants, declare multiple national emergencies, weaponize federal agencies, and fundamentally alter America's role in the world. 13 months to undo systems built over more than 2 centuries. 13 months to prove that democratic institutions are only as strong as the people who defend them. And when those people, Congress members, judges, civil servants, citizens, choose not to defend them, or feel powerless to defend them, those institutions collapse with stunning speed. Looking ahead, the trajectory was alarming. Trump had shown no signs of restraint. His use of emergency powers accelerated throughout 2025. His targeting of enemies expanded. His dismantling of democratic norms continued. And crucially, he faced no meaningful consequences. No impeachment, no court losses that couldn't be appealed. No public backlash strong enough to change course. The machinery of authoritarian consolidation was running smoothly, gathering momentum, becoming harder to stop with each passing day. Project 2025 still had dozens of action items awaiting implementation. The Department of Education was being dismantled but not yet eliminated. Social Security and Medicare faced cuts but hadn't been fully restructured. The civil service purge was ongoing but incomplete. Immigration enforcement could be intensified further. International withdrawals could accelerate. But what nobody expected was that Trump might not stop with his own administration. Discussions were emerging about changing presidential term limits, or finding creative constitutional interpretations to extend his time in power, or ensuring that whoever succeeded him would continue his agenda. The cult of personality around Trump had grown so strong within the Republican Party that many officials genuinely believed American democracy was less important than Trump's movement. They saw him as a transformational figure whose vision transcended traditional constitutional constraints. They believed the ends justified the means, and they were willing to support almost anything if it advanced their ideological goals. The resistance was scattered and demoralized. Progressive organizations scrambled to file lawsuits, but courts moved slowly and often ruled in Trump's favor. News organizations reported on abuses, but faced accusations of bias and threats of investigation. Democratic politicians objected, but lacked the votes to stop anything. State governments tried to resist federal overreach, but federal supremacy and emergency powers overrode their objections. Civil society groups organized protests, but turnout was lower than expected as people felt overwhelmed and defeated. The infrastructure of democratic resistance that had mobilized during Trump's first term was exhausted, fractured, and uncertain how to respond to an opponent wielding such vast powers. International allies privately expressed concern but publicly remained cautious. European leaders who remembered America as a reliable partner during crises now had to navigate a relationship with an administration hostile to multilateralism. Asian allies watched nervously as Trump's transactional approach to foreign policy left them uncertain about American commitments. Latin American countries faced increased pressure from an administration obsessed with immigration and willing to use economic leverage to force compliance. The global order was being reshaped without the stabilizing presence of American leadership, and nobody knew what would emerge from the chaos. Economic consequences were starting to manifest. The uncertainty created by constant emergency declarations and policy reversals spooked markets. Investors couldn't predict regulatory frameworks. Businesses couldn't plan for the future when rules changed by executive order. International trade relationships deteriorated as tariffs escalated. Supply chains that had taken decades to build faced disruption. Economists warned of stagflation, rising prices combined with slowing growth. But Trump dismissed these concerns, insisting his policies would make America stronger. His supporters believed him, His critics felt like they were watching a slow-motion train wreck, powerless to intervene. The most dangerous aspect was the normalization. What had seemed shocking in January 2025 felt routine by January 2026. Emergency declarations that would have triggered constitutional crises in previous administrations barely made headlines anymore. Firings of civil servants for political reasons became commonplace. Weaponization of agencies against enemies was expected. International withdrawals and threats were just Trump being Trump. The constant crisis mode, the relentless stream of controversial actions, the overwhelming pace of change, all of it served to numb people. Outrage fatigue set in. People stopped paying attention because paying attention was exhausting and seemed futile. This was the genius of Trump's most dangerous political move. It wasn't about any single dramatic action that people could rally against. It was about systematic, relentless, overwhelming transformation that happened too fast to resist, too comprehensively to reverse, and too gradually for any single moment to trigger the massive backlash needed to stop it. By the time people fully understood what was happening, the foundations had already been demolished. The new structure was already being built. And the question wasn't whether America could prevent authoritarian consolidation anymore, it was whether America could survive it. But most Americans didn't realize it until it was too late. That's what made this move so dangerous. Not its visibility, but its invisibility. Not its drama, but its bureaucratic efficiency. Not its deviation from plans, but its adherence to a carefully crafted blueprint that had been hiding in plain sight. Trump's most dangerous political move was convincing people he was improvising while methodically executing a plan for permanent transformation. And as 2026 began, with emergency powers firmly in place, with loyalists controlling government, with immunity from prosecution secured, with courts deferring to executive authority, with Congress complicit, and with opposition exhausted, that transformation appeared irreversible. The question now wasn't what Trump would do next. That was clear. More of the same, accelerated and expanded. The question was whether the American experiment in democratic self-governance could survive a president who viewed the Constitution not as a constraint but as an obstacle to be circumvented, who saw emergency powers not as tools for genuine crises but as weapons for political domination, who believed that strength meant crushing opposition rather than tolerating dissent, and who had the power, the immunity, and the will to remake America in his image regardless of what the majority of Americans actually wanted. This was Trump's most dangerous political move. Demonstrating that American democracy's safeguards were weaker than anyone had imagined, that authoritarian consolidation could happen faster than institutions could respond, and that a determined leader with emergency powers, Supreme Court immunity, and partisan control of government could fundamentally transform the world's most powerful democracy before its citizens even fully understood what was being taken from them. And the terrifying part? It wasn't over. It was just beginning.